Hello, dear listeners. Today's conversation is on George Eliot's stupendous Middlemarch, or as my high school English teacher might say, Middlemarch. George Eliot's 1871 novel is, to my money, one of the heights, if not the height, of realism in fiction. A multi-layered, multi-character story of a rural English town just on the cusp of industrialization. Middlemarch is perhaps one of the most compelling novels ever. As the subtitle cues us in, Middlemarch is a study of provincial life, and Eliot puts under the microscope such English institutions as the church, the bank, and marriage, but in a way that is both incredibly compelling and eminently readable. Today's conversation is a bit rambling, but we cover the major characters of the book, Eliot's approach to writing a story, and what a good realist novel looks like. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, I've been Mr. Brooke Maxing, where I'm just scatterbrained and generally well-meaning.
Oh yeah, or you start like a quotation and then you like misattribute it, or you don't even finish it.
Ramble and monologue. Anyone who will listen.
You know, I've got some notes too. You say to somebody when they're talking about it. But...
No, I was quite something in my day, but not all that.
Yeah. I like when he's talking to Cosmo and he's like, oh man, I got some notes. Like, I need somebody to organize them. Like, maybe I'd write a book. And then you just never hear about it after that.
He's the worst landlord in the county.
Yeah, he's one of the rare vibes-based landlords.
But he was my favorite character.
Oh,
I wish there'd been more of him, because every time we saw the page, I was just like, "Oh yeah, just ramble."
And also,
no angst.
Well, and he's always just kind of like, you know, it's not good for women to do that, but I don't know, he's
it's not really my business.
Yeah, exactly. like he's reflecting the views of the time, but not in like the weird way. He's just kind of like, you're just gonna do whatever you want.
And you know what? I'll help.
Yeah.
My favorite bit is when Dorothea asks him to write to Ladislaw, but just like to give him like an update, and under no circumstances like invite him to come back to Middlemarch. And then the uncle just keeps writing, and eventually he's like, I could get Ladislaw to come here and help me organize my notes.
Yeah, and the narrator says it would be a shame to, you know, restart such a good opening just based on this. So might as well just keep it.
Might as well just keep going.
Yeah, when you're just like so good at letter writing that you're like, yeah, I'll just leave in that opening.
No, this is fire.
Yeah.
Damn, I was spitting.
Yeah, no, that's literally what it's the Mr. Brooke. The Mr. move is to go, damn, I was spitting, and then to immediately stop spitting. Yeah, oh man,
what a book.
Yeah. So,
ooh, man.
I was a little worried. I was like, we're gonna have to. This is quite a book. This is a real double, triple decker, even 8 volumes. Yeah. So
785 pages in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that was my bad. I literally was so excited to read Middlemarch in March that I didn't even look at the page count until I got the book, and I stared at it for like a day and didn't start because I was like, oh man, 800 pages. Why did I do this? So
yeah, I remember last Monday I was like, oh, better get started. And then I read the first chapter and I was like, that's enough for today. And I immediately regretted it for the rest of the last 2 weeks because it set me so far back.
Oh, what a nice pace. Then you're like, oh, okay. Yeah,
I'm on the clock.
I have a Middlemarch origin story that is not actually involved with me reading it. So,
okay.
So I was, listeners, you might have guessed, I was a English nerd in high school, and I took the AP English test. And one of the prose samples that they gave you, I didn't recognize it because I hadn't really read that much at the time. And so then we get back from taking it. We're talking to our AP English teacher, who is an eccentric old man named Mr. Ratterman, who was probably the most energetic old man I think I've ever known. And he was like, what was the prose passages? What did they give you? Like, we couldn't remember. And somebody goes, I think it was Middlemarch. And he goes, Middlemarch. like, and he just like he was like so excited that I like will have never forgot the way he said Middlemarch, I think, ever. Because he was like, one, he expected us to like it immediately, and I don't think we did. Two, I wish I could remember what it was, but this is like the distant cloud of high school memory. And then three, it was just the way he says Middlemarch. Like, I just have never forgotten that delivery, which I think, as John was saying, I think that tone is correct for Middlemarch because there's really quite a lot of it. So,
well, I mean, this is a book with kind of a somewhat legendary reputation. I think this is almost the closest thing from what I've read. I don't know if your edition came with an introductory essay. Mine came with an essay by Rebecca Mead, where she talks about how this is a book that she read when she was young, and then she's come back to it multiple times over the years. And it made me think of nothing so much as the way people in your favorite country and mine, the People's Republic of China, talk about another novel we've read, The Dream of the Red Chamber.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking that too. Yeah, Mao Zedong said, what is it? He's read it 10 times, Dream of the Red Chamber, and he recommends everyone read it at least 5 times.
But Middlemarch seems to be as close as we have in English, despite the fact that it is, I will note, 1,200 pages shorter than Dream of the Red Chamber.
And it doesn't have as quite an interesting character as Bao Yu.
Yeah. Well, who does?
Yeah. Who can? The precious jade. Yeah. So.
Well, this is not, unfortunately, a Dream of the Red Chamber episode. Folks, it's the Middlemarch episode. We're talking Middlemarch in the middle of March.
On St. Patrick's Day, even. So
welcome to the Infinite Library.
Yeah, I'm your host, Ben.
And I'm John.
And yeah, this is, as I was saying, there's a lot to talk about in this novel, but it's also quite amazing. And I think, and I don't know, and I want to start just by saying, my copy had a pull quote from Virginia Woolf that said, this is one of the few novels written for grown-ups. And I was thinking about that because I hadn't heard about it. And I was thinking about that quote as I read it. And it really is, because like she is so good at George Eliot, who is actually, that's her pen name. Her real name is, I believe, Mary Evans. Mary Ann Evans. And she's so good at presenting things ambiguously and with both sides that you're never in any way like being talked down to. And the narrator is continually like telling you interesting things, applying scientific metaphors, setting characters up against each other. And it's just such an intelligent novel for what is essentially like middle class marriage plots, which may sound dumb. And in fact, we could get into that later. But there's so much thought and complexity here for everything. And there's just so much of it that it's just, I don't know. I like read it again this time and I wanted to read it again. And I was just like, yeah, this is George Eliot, one of the best to ever do it in terms of a realist novel about people that is like very attuned to the way your social landscape influences your actions, which I think is what being an adult means. So that's, I don't know. I was thinking about that this time.
Yeah. I can't disagree with that at all. I think that one of the themes of the show as it's developed so far is kind of our somewhat mixed opinions on literature written around this time, kind of the Victorian greats. We talked about that a lot in our fraud episode. And I think that Middlemarch is the first book we've really interfaced with for the show that's directly like from that time. And I found it to be so refreshing because there is like a little bit of like moralizing in there. But compared to even like the really great authors and kind of this Victorian tradition, like your Dickenses, there's not a lot of it. there's not a whole lot of like heavy-handed, like didactic passages about like the proper way to behave. Like the book has a much more like you said, it's a novel for adults. Like there's always this element of bittersweetness of none of these people are bad. None of them are like cartoon villains, the way that again some people in Victorian novels can kind of be turned into. They're not caricatures. They feel so lived in and distinct, and you spend so much time in each character's shoes. There's really not a protagonist in this novel. Everyone seemingly, at least not every character, but all of our kind of viewpoint characters, of which I'd say there's probably like 5 or 6, all get, I would say, about equal time. And so you get to understand them, and you get to see the way that, their own personal foibles and flaws lead them into situations, and their own virtues lead them into situations. But you also just see, like you were saying, Ben, the way that the social reality that they live in affects them. I think that the opening of the book is really interesting, where we start off following a character named Dorothea Brooks, who's a young woman of pretty sparkling, erudition for this time, a time when women can't really get education the way men did. And the book is very like upfront that like in a different age, she would have been the equal to Saint Teresa of Avila. She would have been a great scholar and reformer of religion, but because she is born in England in the 1800s, she is sort of tied up in what is a fairly mundane marriage plot, basically, like you said, Ben. But then, we get to the end, and the ending of this book, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but the ending of this book I found really affecting. I've heard the last paragraph of this book described as one of the like most beautiful and moving paragraphs in English literature. And I, after finishing it, this is my first time through. Ben, I know it was your second time through.
Yeah, second.
So you kind of knew what was coming at the end, but for me, I avoided reading that last paragraph. I kind of kept being tempted through it. I was like, I wonder what that last paragraph is. People have been saying it's really, really good. And then I was just like, I can't. I'm gonna let it hit me. And yeah, the kind of final message this book leaves you with is incredibly beautiful. And yeah, I really enjoyed this book, Ben. Thank you so much for choosing it.
That's a hook a little hook to keep you in line, listeners, to hear us break down what that last paragraph is if you yourself have not read it. But I'm really glad you liked it, John, because I think like I agree that I'm somewhat dismissive of some Victorian like literature conventions. As we've talked about before, I think there was a road not taken between Tristram Shandy and what was the other one? Like Pamela, I think.
Pamela, something with a C.
Clarissa, right?
Clarissa.
Yeah.
Yes,
and clearly, English fiction went Clarissa, not Tristram Shandy. Tristram Shandy has all these flights of fancy, fourth wall breaks, like weird stylistic things. But like, you read George Eliot and you're like, man, this can really do something in like the right hands. And I think like her approach to the characters and presenting them as fully as she can, her constant allusions to scientific inquiry. For instance, the subtitle of Middlemarch is a study in provincial life. Yes. And it's a study of these characters like Dorothea, where she has these high aspirations, these ideals, almost like religious yearning. And she's constrained by being in a rural town in like the 1830s, being an orphan because her parents died, and basically like needing to marry someone because that's what's expected of her, more or less.
Yeah, I want to take like a quick little detour here because I don't know that we're going to have a like very natural way to segue into this. But something I found really, really interesting in this book is the role of Catholicism in it.
Yeah.
Because for like Anglo literature of this period, again, kind of looping back to our themes of the show, again, this is being written kind of contemporaneously with a lot of kind of later Gothic stuff. You know, I don't think we're quite at Dracula yet, but we're nearly there. Or this is like maybe even contemporaneous with Dracula. But English, you know, the Anglo subject had such a loathing for all things papists.
Papery. Yeah.
You know, a lot of people have theorized that the English Gothic tradition is really kind of based in this kind of fear and loathing of Catholicism, you know, that we see in stuff like The Monk or in the Castle of Otranto. And, you know, this book takes a very kind of different tack where, again, it opens with this passage about how in another lifetime, you know, Dorothea would have been a Catholic saint, basically. And she does have these religious yearnings, which are at some level frustrated just by kind of the deracinated nature of Anglicanism at this time. You know, there's a couple other characters who have relationships with the church. And something that becomes very clear is that most people going into the church at this time, into the Church of England specifically, are not going into it because they have genuine religious convictions. They're going into it because it's a stable, well-paying career path that a striving young man with an education can break into and, you know, find a stable income and, you know, rising prospects.
And it's a quick side note. Did you catch when Mary Garth is sort of ridiculing people for doing that? Where Mary Garth says something like, oh, all these idiots just can become vicars and priests, and then we're supposed to take them seriously when they really don't have anything to actually say for themselves. And like she starts saying that to one of the priest characters. I think it's Mr. Fairbrother or Featherstone. I might be confusing the two.
Featherstone is not a priest. He's the old man who's dying at the beginning.
So Fairbrother and Fairbrother, by the way, is having to tell Mary who about the person that actually loves her, Fred, while he's also interested in her. And she basically goes on this tear about how you can basically just fail upward into being a priest. So I think basically George Eliot even has that in there too. I just wanted to say that. So
Fairbrother, even as a character, is interesting because he is somebody who did do that, and he's very unhappy throughout the novel because he wants to be an entomologist, basically.
So he also has ideals, and he doesn't he talk to Lydgate about them, and they never exactly see eye to eye, I think. He's always talking to Lydgate about stuff.
Him and Lydgate strike up a friendship because they're both kind of men. He sees himself as more of a man of science, and he basically comes out to Lydgate and is like, yeah, you know, I went into the church because it was a stable career with that, but my real passion is for insects. And would you like to read this monograph I wrote on insects in the book of Exodus, where apparently he went through the whole book of Exodus and exhaustively researched all the insects that the Israelites could have run into on their journey, and what symbolic role they might have played in that. Which, if that was a real book, I would love to read that. That sounds like a blast, personally.
It would probably be better than The Key to All Mythologies if it had ever been finished. That is Casaubon's attempt to... It's never exactly clear, but I think it's supposed to connect all of pre-Christian belief systems together or something. I could never quite discern the shape of The Key to All Mythologies.
Well, I think that's somewhat on purpose. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, we could, do we want to run down some of the characters? Because we've kind of already jumped into that. We could do that.
Yeah, might as well. So this is a book with a big cast of characters. Again, that's almost the point of it. Eliot is really trying to give us a real picture of what living in kind of one of these rural villages in again, kind of 1830s England was like. And, you know, we mostly follow kind of the middle to upper strata of this town. There are a couple scenes with kind of lower station characters, but they don't really get a lot of time. Maybe that's something we can talk about as we go. But I think, it'll definitely be easier to kind of lay out what we want to talk about if we can kind of give some idea of who our major players are, at least.
So it might be useful to pair the two idealists So there is Dorothea Brooke, we've already talked about. I think we've done a sufficiently fine introduction for her at the moment. Then there is Tertius Lydgate, who is a man of 27, we were told. And he comes to Middlemarch to kind of get established as a doctor and to also do research, because he's very interested in his own research, and he wants to do experiments. He's scientifically minded, but he also, as he said, wants to get established in Middlemarch. And he has kind of an idealism to do research that, as we'll talk about, gets kind of thwarted. So then, if we're going to talk about pairings, Dorothea Brooke falls in love with I believe it's Edward Casaubon,
yes,
who is a reverend and is a very old man.
He's 45.
yeah, he's 45 compared to Dorothea, who is it says she's 19 at the beginning?
No, she's 25 at the end, I believe. So,
I like 22 or something.
I believe. Her exact age is not important, but there is it is said at one point in the book that he is old enough to be her father.
Yeah. And so he is the Reverend. He's working on the key to all mythologies, as we've said, which is this. It sounds like writing a dissertation, honestly, John. It's this thing that takes forever. It's very complicated. He's clearly very invested in sort of tying together all of these kind of like mythological figures together, I believe, as kind of like a theoretical justification for, I guess, whatever religion he was following, because I guess he's Protestant, probably, or is he Catholic?
Presumably Anglican.
Yeah, Anglican. Yeah, so he's Anglican. And then they get paired together for reasons we can go into a moment. And then Tertius Lydgate is paired with Rosamond Vincy. So the Vincies are a kind of well-to-do middle-class family. Rosamond is kind of like one of the prettiest girls in Middlemarch, more or less, attracts a lot of attention. Her brother Fred is he's in that position of being kind of a middle-class fail son.
He's a fail son, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He's kind of a middle-class fail son. He doesn't know exactly what he's supposed to do.
He's failed out of university at the beginning of the novel and is just kind of kicking around at home, riding horses with like other local ne'er-do-wells and gambling.
And gambling all of his money at the Green Dragon, which is a great bar name. And so Fred, however, is in love with Mary Garth, who we've mentioned, and the Garths are kind of like a little lower middle class. Mr. Garth is a land surveyor, and so that's sort of the romantic pairings. And then we can talk about some of the side characters if we want, or we can save them for later.
One fairly important character if we're talking about romantic pairings, and that's Mr. Will Ladislaw.
Well, that's true.
Who is Casaubon's half Polish cousin.
His illicit Polish blood.
Who's kind of a local. He has a poor reputation, kind of on the basis of being somewhat foreign and kind of again being another young layabout who kind of can't figure out what he wants to do with his life. He and Dorothea kind of end up having a connection to each other that Casaubon quickly becomes somewhat jealous of, and they're kind of on again, off again relationship, I guess we could say, serves as kind of a backbone of the plot insofar as this book has one.
Yeah, because Dorothea marries Casaubon for noble spiritual reasons.
She basically hopes that even though she's a woman and she cannot be educated and kind of have her own intellectual or spiritual pursuits, goal, she can, again, do what she's been told her duty is. She can attach herself to a man of a lot of learning and spiritual fortitude and, help him achieve his goals. It quickly becomes obvious, though, that Casaubon is actually not a great scholar. He's basically an old pedant who, I kind of thought of him as like a forms guy.
Oh, yeah.
He's like a guy who basically Casaubon's problem is he can't read German, and so his scholarship is incredibly out of date.
Right.
And so he reminds me of someone who like thinks they're very, very well researched, but is like outside of the academy. Not saying you have to be in the academy to do like research, but thinks that basically like because they just read a lot of stuff on Wikipedia and post about it on Reddit all day, that they're some kind of expert in a field, but they actually don't know kind of what is the cutting edge, stuff, because they don't actually read, academic work of any kind.
Yeah, and John, being in grad school, this time he sort of came across as like a nightmare version of being in grad school because like one, he's not doing cutting edge stuff. Two, he's clearly sunk all of his time into this project that he will not finish. And three, the purpose of the project is like clearly not important. Like, yeah, it's the key to all mythologies, right? But like he can't do that. And like it sort of turns him into this like petty, jealous person who's like not willing to admit that he made a mistake or to ask for certain kinds of help or to even start reading German, where like, as Will Ladislaw points out, that's where all of the accomplishments in sort of comparative mythology, I guess, are being made at the time. So
yeah, like I think Casaubon, I think, is a really interesting character, and he's someone who kind of, despite myself, I found myself empathizing with to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I don't know how you felt about him, but he's clearly someone who, again, kind of by happenstance, he's from a wealthy family. He has this position in the church that does not seem to require a lot of his time. So he has all this time to pursue his passion project, which he has this great work of comparative mythology and comparative religion. But his actual like talents are so outstripped by his ambition. And again, I think there's almost kind of an interesting reading where he doesn't want to finish the book because, again, Casaubon is interesting because, again, he's very, very old. I guess, again, maybe 45 was seemed a lot older back then because people just lived rougher. I don't know. I don't think of 45 as particularly old, like elderly, but maybe
I spoke a little too strongly. He's very old.
No, I mean people do
yeah.
like comment on it in the book about how old he is.
Yeah,
he's clearly also in bad health, even like when they get married, which I'm sure is also part of it.
Yeah. What did you think about that epigraph from Anatomy of Melancholy? That's just like scholars are mostly like ill and depressed. Like that's what, like it's like they walk with a stoop and they're not they don't get exercise or so, like, anyway. Yeah.
But I was going to say, I think there's kind of an interesting reading where the book is kind like writing this book is his project.
Yeah.
And so if it ever ends, then he has nothing else to do, especially from the standpoint, his ambitions are so great. He's like, I'm going to tie together every world mythology to like make some point, like some grand point about like the truth of Christianity. It's such a big project that if he ever did finish it, like then he's like, oh, I guess I might as well die.
Right. Yeah. Like what else would I do? And if I could real quick, there's a section and we can get a little bit of Eliot's prose about Casaubon that I highlighted. So the narrator just kind of starts commenting in first person, like a lot of Victorian narrators would. For my part, I'm very sorry for him. It is an easy lot at best, but what we call highly taught and yet not to enjoy, to be present at the great spectacle of life and never to be liberated from a small, hungry, shivering self, never to be fully possessed by the glory we behold, never to have our consciousness rapturously transformed into the vividness of a thought, the ardor of a passion, the energy of an action, but always to be scholarly and uninspired, ambitious and timid, scrupulous and dim-sighted. Being a dean or even a bishop would make little difference, I fear, to Mr. Casaubon's uneasiness. Doubtless, some ancient Greek has observed that behind the big mask and the speaking trumpet, there must always be our poor little eyes peeping as usual and our timorous lips more or less under anxious control. Ooh, wow. Yeah. So yeah, again, like he's like caught in between those two things, and he's also very egotistical because like whenever Dorothea wants to kind of bring this up to him, he reacts as if he's been injured, basically. So
I think he knows deep down that he is wasting his time, but it's too late. He's 45.
Yeah.
He can't learn to read German, and he'd have to throw away all his notes and start over.
his many notes. So, and I think he makes a nice contrast to Lydgate, who at the beginning of the novel is reading like cutting edge scientific research for fun, basically, because he's like really invested in kind of like making a scientific breakthrough.
I wonder what you think. Do you think that Eliot is maybe making a point about kind of the value of different like kinds of study, more or less? Like I kind of wonder that because this book does, like, obviously, like you said, there's a lot of science kind of metaphorically woven in. Obviously, she's writing at a time that is very, very, a lot of scientific progress has been made very, very rapidly. There is also like a lot of stuff kind of about history in the book and about kind of. There's some melancholy like longings for like an older age, like again with the stuff about Teresa of Avila at the beginning, where there's kind of this idea that the world used to be bigger, and we're kind of in this weird middle period. And things like Lydgate's embracing of science and research is really about moving forward into this hopefully better tomorrow, whereas Casaubon is drearily like looking back into the past,
right, in an attempt to discern some like just shape of a connection between everything, when like really we're just moving we're going past towards like newer ways of looking at to it. I think so, because like also too occasionally the narrator, and I have another quick bit when she's talking about lenses, so she's referring to Mrs. Cadwallader, who is a side character we haven't mentioned. And Mrs. Cadwallader is described as always talking in like pickled epigrams. She's very cutting.
She's the local like town gossip, and therefore one of my favorite characters.
She's very messy and she's very cutting.
She's mother. She's serving cunt. I love her.
Yeah. So and the narrator takes a moment to kind of use a scientific metaphor. Even with a microscope directed on a water drop, we find ourselves making interpretations which turn out to be rather coarse. Whereas under a weak lens, you may seem to see a creature exhibiting an active veracity into which other smaller creatures actively play as if there were so many animated tax pennies. A stronger lens reveals to you certain tiniest hairlets, which make vortices for these victims, while the swallower waits passively at his receipt of custom. In this way, metaphorically speaking, a strong lens applied to Mrs. Cadwallad's matchmaking will show a play of minute causes, producing what may be called thought and speech vortices to bring her the sort of food she needed. Oh man, great. So again, you can see like Eliot clearly sees the benefit of looking at humans scientifically, which I think, as you were saying, reflects the kind of like about to be industrialized Middlemarch town, because as we're told, the railroad is basically almost there. Like it got into town, some people are unhappy about it, but industry is coming whether we like it or not to Middlemarch. And I think I think there's a kind of, to me, I think for Eliot, she clearly sees a benefit in looking at multiple kinds of disciplines to tell stories, because I don't think she would be invested in like scientific researchers as characters and scientific metaphors. So
I think there's also an element where, again, it seems like she is very skeptical of sort of a scholarly approach to religion. I think that part of what she seems to admire in Dorothea, or wants us to admire in Dorothea, is that she has kind of almost a mystical temperament. She's the comparison to her is Teresa of Avila, one of the great mystics of kind of the Counter-Reformation like era Spanish Church, for those who are not Catholic. And I think that kind of this dull scholarly approach to religion, she clearly sees is dead in some way. And that's why it only seems to attract pedants like Casaubon or social climbers like Fairbrother, rather than people of genuine religious sentiment or ideal. And, I don't I don't feel like the book says that like Lydgate would have been a cleric in a different time, but I definitely think that the book has a much like higher level of respect for medicine and that kind of work than it does for sort of the work of being a cleric in kind of this deracinated Protestant church.
Yeah, and I think too, as the narrator told us, like Lydgate, is helping people, which is very important to him, and he wants to do both. He wants to help people and make scientific breakthroughs. But, and we can get into Rosamund's character. Due to his marriage to Rosamund Vincy, he is slowly kind of he has to compromise. He basically has to compromise on what he wanted to do, and like that kind of his arc towards compromising is sort of like, I would say, like the back half of the story, maybe, because he kind of comes onto the scene and he's like, the cool researcher guy, and like he attracts Rosamund's attention, and there's going to be a good marriage, and then due to their relationship, like he has to almost give it up. And he ends up moving into London and becoming a fashionable doctor and treating rich people who have gout. And at the end, he's at least able to write a little treatise on gout, but it's clearly not the kind of scientific breakthrough that he like wanted to make.
And he dies at 50.
Oh, right. I forgot. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I wonder if that's because of stress. I don't know. They don't say why, but like,
I kind of got that impression.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's how Eliot would have worded it necessarily.
Oh, what did you think about him when he starts taking opium for fun?
We love it, folks. Sometimes it's just like, oh, it must have been fun back then.
You could just prescribe yourself a little bit of opium, and then you could just sit at home. Yeah.
So I actually want to take a minute and talk a little bit about Lydgate and his marriage. So it's really interesting. I think Lydgate is also a really, really interesting character because he is kind of the one character who at the beginning of the book is like a total foreigner, basically. Like he's not a foreigner in terms of he's not from a different country or anything, but he's coming from outside of Middlemarch. He has purchased the practice of Mr. Peacock, who was kind of the local town doctor before Lydgate, and had this very, very established practice. He was a well-known, well-liked member of the community. Lots of people came to him. He seems to have made a fair bit of money doing this. And Lydgate sort of comes into this town, and it's not so much that he's not like a con man. Like he's not like, oh, I'm gonna like get one over on these bumpkins and make a bunch of cash so I can go do my research. But something I found really interesting is he kind of, to me, represents the way that commerce is encroaching on this community kind of as we approach, like in kind of the same way the train is.
Yeah.
I think Lydgate kind of serves like a similar role where he comes into town and he attempts to just kind of insert himself into this community, but he does not have the ties to people that other people do because they've all lived in the same place for their whole lives. And so he comes in and no one trusts him. Medicine, especially at this time, is like a very intimate thing. These are not people who are kind of used to our modern idea of medicine where it's like you see your doctor once a year, if that, and he talks to you for 15 minutes, maybe over a Zoom call, and then your insurance bills you for $500.
Well, and crucially, he doesn't prescribe drugs. That's one of these things that everybody kind of starts gossiping about.
Yeah, he's proud of it too.
Yeah.
Because I guess at this time, basically, like you prescribe people drugs and you got like a kickback off that, like very directly, like you worked with drug manufacturers, I guess.
And I think too, he said like, I think people were just handing drugs out left and right. Like he's like, yeah, sometimes you don't need to prescribe drugs. It's kind of like, I think what when the narrator is kind of explaining his viewpoint.
Yeah. But I think that's also what attracts Rosamund to him, is that he is foreign. She's kind of one of her notable qualities at the beginning of the book is that, again, she attracts all this attention from the local boys, but she's not interested in any of them. She thinks they're all dull and boring.
Right.
Even up to the point where she finds her own brothers to be insufferable because they're just so provincial and dullardly in her opinion. And she meets Lydgate, and they, you know, kind of spark this romance because they have this it's not a I don't want to say it's not a genuine connection. That's maybe too much. But they're both in love with the idea of each other.
Yes.
Lydgate is attracted
100%.
to the idea of the, you know, her as this kind of beautiful provincial girl whose family has all these connections. Rosamund is in love with the idea that Lydgate is educated and sophisticated and comes from outside of this town that she's come to be incredibly bored by. And he has a very like high-placed family members, like his uncle is like a lord or something. I don't
or like
remember
a baron, I think, something like that.
Yeah, I can't remember what his exact rank is. It's not he never even shows up like in person in the book.
Right.
But they both kind of fall in love with the idea of each other. And
also too, Lydgate has the idea of a wife, which is somebody who you work really hard and you come home and your wife is just supposed to remove all of your cares. It's just sort of like it's described like a lap of luxury with music and sweet caresses, and like basically like marriage is just kind of like a vacation, kind of. It's like what like and I also love too, like Rosamund is trained to play music, which I guess was expected of housewives, but the narrator says at one point that it was a lot of tinkling and smearing. Is what the narrator says, which is such a great
she knows
description.
how to do it, but she's not particularly talented.
Yeah. And so like
there's a later point in the book where Lydgate like comes downstairs after like a long night, because at some point he has to like start gambling basically to make money. That's the problem he runs into, is basically no one will come to him for medical advice, and so Rosamund comes from this very well-to-do family, so all of a sudden, like, they have all these debts, and he can't afford to pay his debts. And so he ends up having to eventually at some point gamble, and he comes down one night, I can't remember exactly when, but Rosamund is like singing at the piano with like someone who's come to visit, and he is just like, can you stop with the caterwauling?
And it's with Will Ladislaw, who everyone kind of hates because he's the newspaper guy. Like he got a job as a newspaperman, and then he's just like paying visits to attractive ladies. And he's like, great, Will's here. And too, Rosamund's expected this level of comfort that like they can't go down on. Because that would be intolerable for her. And there's another I think,
and humiliating.
Oh yeah, and humiliating. And there's another character who's a doctor who's described as like being able to be a doctor and have a huge family, but his house sucks. And Lydgate originally is like, I don't want to be like that guy, but then he's like, fuck, I have to be like that guy, because like I have all these debts from like what I thought I was supposed to be wanting in terms of like furniture and like spending whatever expenditures they had. So it's like they're perfect. They're at like perfect cross purposes, and so like, and you sort of see their relationship kind of like deteriorate from this like this fantasy idealization of each other.
Yeah. You know, I think what also is interesting in Lydgate's story is, again, the role debt plays in it.
Yeah.
You know, I think that if you had asked me before we read the book, like if this was going to be like a novel where like money was going to come up a lot, I probably would have said, yeah, probably. But it probably played like a larger role than I was expecting. And again, I think that
I would say even,
a ton of this book is just people kind of having debt and needing to figure out how to get out of debt, basically.
Right.
And again, I think it's really interesting. Obviously, like, there was debt pre-capitalism, blah, blah, blah. You know, there's plenty of research about actually a lot of these like rural communities had very sophisticated means of kind of tracking who owed who what. But I think that, again, kind of looking at this book as being written in 1870, kind of during the Industrial Revolution and kind of the rise of industrial capitalism, kind of looking back at this time 40 years prior, you know, in the grand scope of time, you know, hardly an eye blink. I think that kind of the way that, for lack of a better term, I can't think of a better term, modernity is creeping in is really interesting. And I think that the debt is a big part of that, because crucially, a lot of the people who are kind of accruing debts in the book are young people. Fred Vinci in particular kind of has like a lot of debt from his gambling. and also from kind of failing out of his studies. And Lydgate, again, gets a lot of debt. And it feels to me, at least, like the debts they're accruing, like this is something that people of like kind of an older generation would never have had to do, whether because they have more, either because the characters were probably just have more money already, and they just never would have had to. Like it seems like Mr. Vinci, Fred's father, could pay his debts off, except he wants to make a point about how he shouldn't have to.
Right.
And it seems like, he could also probably help Lydgate out with his debts if he were so obliged. And I think that, again, the same way that the railroad is encroaching, another kind of modern thing that crops up kind of midway through the book is, like you said, there's a newspaper that kind of Dorothea's uncle purchases, and it's a liberal newspaper. And then there's also a hospital, the opening of a hospital that Lydgate kind of foolishly agrees to kind of be the provost of for no salary, is kind of another big part of where his financial woes are coming from, because he's committed to doing all this work at this hospital for basically gratis to, again, kind of create this illusion that he's this upstanding gentleman who doesn't need money. Meanwhile, he's working like half of his like working hours are spent at this hospital where he's not getting paid anything.
And that's another example, too, of like the idealism of his character sort of landing him in a jam, because he's like, yeah, like, of course I'd want to work at the cutting edge hospital, but, I don't make any money doing it. Like, and like initially that should be fine. But, once he marries Rosamund, it's not. And I think, yeah.
And it also seems like this thing where there was a point where being either I don't know for sure. I don't know enough about like English social history to say for sure. But the impression I was getting from the book is that there was either a time where being a doctor was financially lucrative enough that you could basically spend half your time, kind of doing whatever and get by fine financially, or only rich people became doctors. Right. And so it was kind of, it was something you did more as like like an amusement or like as a hobby than like a career you needed to make money at.
Right. Yeah. And that's why I think that Wrench, like, if we don't meet Wrench, he's just mentioned, but Wrench is clearly like a huge family man who is also a doctor, but his stuff isn't as good as upper class people's stuff, or like people that have money. I also think too, I like that you brought up the timeline, because I hadn't thought about this before, but there must obviously be kind of a parallel between the compromises that these characters have to make and whatever compromised position we're in circa 1870s. Because remember like when we were talking about Goth, there was clearly like this, like, oh, if only we could go back to pre-industrialization. And that was kind of like some of the impetus for Gothic, like landscapes, Gothic settings, that kind of thing. And, here Eliot is like, listen, we're here now. It's 1870. And if we're going to go back, let's go back to when people were compromised and had to kind of figure out what life was going to be like without having to be like, oh, wasn't it simpler before? And like, there's definitely is some of that there. But to me, there seems to be like a twinning between like the timeline when it was written and the kind of like compromises that the main characters have to do.
Well, it's interesting. There are passages, where she is obviously kind of saying like, in those days, people acted differently with each other. In those days, things cost less money. But it's never with this, at least to my reading, it's not with like, he's not like return with a V. Like we have to,
right.
Return to the 1830s. It's always kind of with this eye towards this is how things were, and it led people to behave in certain ways and make certain choices that have then led us to here.
But yes, I agree. It's sort of like the way things happened before, and that's just kind of the way it was. Like, again, she's very ambiguous in her presentation, and like, the fact that everybody agrees that it would be bad for Dorothea to marry Casaubon And she just does it anyway. Like Dorothea does it anyway, and the narrator says that's just what she did, basically. And then the sort of fallout from that, drives the story onward.
So I have a question for you, Ben. Kind of tying into our conversation last week. Do you think that Middlemarch is a determinist novel?
Oh, that's a good question.
Like, do you think that? So I'm of two minds. So again, kind of in your example of Dorothea. Like, there is an element where her entire kind of social system, more or less, is kind of telling her, like, hey, this is a bad idea. You shouldn't marry Casaubon. Please don't do that. Her uncle says it, kind of Sir James, who's a character we haven't talked about, who's kind of a well-to-do, like, local landowner who starts off the book clearly infatuated with Dorothea, tells her not to do it. Her sister tells her not to do it. Everyone in her life who, and it seems like kind of the scuttlebutt around Middlemarch is like, oh, she's thinking about doing this and she really, really shouldn't.
Right. Yeah.
But then basically Eliot is kind of like, but there was something inherent in her character that kind of made her do it. And again, it's kind of this, for lack of a term, like this spiritual quality she has that, again, in a different time would have led her to this life of mystical contemplation, is now leading her to make this foolish choice to marry Casaubon. So on the one hand, there is this element where it is kind of, she's making a choice, and it's a choice that to the people around her seems somewhat perverse. But Eliot kind of, from her remove as our omniscient narrator, is kind of like, yes, but it was actually because she has kind of this inherently perverse streak to her that, would have led her in one way in a different time, and in this time is leading her to make this bad choice.
And remember, Celia at one point accuses her of always changing her mind, but Dorothea goes, I just always did what I thought was best. So, like, is your question, is she determined by her social reality or by her own character?
I mean, my question for you is, in your reading, again, using that as an example, like, do you think Eliot thinks people, like, actually have some kind of control over their own lives and destiny, or is it, again, kind of this more determined, for lack of a better term, way of going about things, where, again, people have certain like inborn qualities and certain, social relationships they find themselves embedded in, and those things make the choices for them, not some like idea of free will.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think Eliot's clearly interested in the way, as I said at the opening, like social reality constrains you and your choices. Like gossip is a big part in this book that we haven't got into, but like various characters are forced into doing things because of people's opinion of them. And I think, while I think in Hun Huang, there was this kind of like sort of surrendering to fate that I felt like the book had. One, being a kind of historical novel, and two, like being like the character exists to get these scrolls into this area, kind of. And I think he kind of comes to terms with that. In this one, though, I think what's interesting about it is there's clearly an attempt to present as much as possible a realistic, like, social portrayal. So in that case, like, yeah, I think in some ways a lot of our character is determined by our social reality and not who we think we are. That being said, I'm going to reach into the historical reading bag and pull out an answer, which says that in my background reading, I believe the person who wrote the introduction to my edition, let me check her name real quick. Oh yeah, Rosemary Ashton wrote an interesting book on George Eliot, and in that she points out that George Eliot was really impacted by Spinoza, particularly translating Spinoza's Ethics. And one of his points in Ethics is conatus, which is like the quality of a being to strive for its own excellence, sort of its own like self-preservation. And I think while we may not call that exactly free will, I think that's her like idealism. That's Eliot's idealism. Like, I will try to do the best that I can in any situation. And that's going to change, but that's like as close as you could get to free will. And for Dorothea, at one point that's marrying Casaubon. And then for another point that becomes, as we mentioned, marrying Will. So I think like, there is a deterministic element, I think, in this story in terms of social reality, But I think Eliot still wants that kind of like, I wouldn't exactly call it free will, but the idea that you want to achieve your best self as kind of like a generating force, I think. And the friction between those two, I think, is like a lot of what drives the book, I would say.
Kind of like the Marx quote where it's like, men make history, but they do not make it as they please.
Right. Yeah, well, exactly. And I think that's like kind of what the book is about too, because, these characters impact each other, but they end up in different social relationships. And like, if I was still in high school English, one of the big things we talked about was ironic stories where like the character ends up trapped and not free. And that's clearly what happens to Lydgate. Like he ends up compromising so much and kind of diminished. And while he does end up marrying Rosamund and they end up, getting along fine, he's clearly just reduced. And Dorothea, and maybe we're jumping ahead to the end, but the narrator even addresses whether or not Dorothea is reduced by marrying Will and not doing her own thing, which is covered in the end.
Well, it's interesting because, you bring up the Spinoza's idea of conatus, did you say?
Yeah, conatus. I'm probably mispronouncing it. It's Latin.
I have not gotten around to Spinoza, and I should. But, it's interesting, again, kind of this idea of like the conscious beings like strive to like become their best self or to achieve as much as they can is really interesting kind of because as I was reading through this book, I think one of the biggest themes of this book is failure. Like, really none of the characters in this book, even when they come to kind of a happy conclusion, none of them are successful on their own terms, kind of as they start off. Maybe Dorothea probably is the person who gets the closest, but that's kind of because her goals are so different than other people's. Like Lydgate, like you said, kind of ends up diminished, and rather than kind of pursuing this career of research, kind of is forced to become a fashionable doctor to supply for his wife's extravagant lifestyle. Fred Vinci he ends up married happily to the girl he loves, but marry. He ends up kind of becoming slumming it as a farmer, basically, and kind of never recovers his reputation in the town, despite the fact that like other farmers kind of in the broader agricultural community like think that he's really smart and like on his shit.
Right. Yeah.
At the start of the book, the uncle, who's a character we haven't talked about, even though but my favorite character, Dorothea's uncle, Arthur, is kind of shown to be this guy. He kind of starts as an older gentleman. He's a lifelong bachelor, and he is kind of not ridiculed, but he's kind of known throughout the town for kind of being a dope and a guy who's never gotten it together. And he just has enough money that it's never mattered. Like he can just dodder and bumble through life. And he lives to a ripe old age, as we learn at the end. So maybe there's something to that. I don't know. But I find it really interesting that, there's this tension between the aspirations we have for ourselves, the circumstances we find ourselves in, and kind of the attempt to make those two lines meet somewhere in the middle, for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah.
And inevitably, like that takes the form of some kind of failure. Yeah. And I think that part of what's so beautiful about this book is that it really, I think, is trying to point to the fact that like that is everybody. There is not a single person in kind of modernity who has ever fully lived up to their ideals. It's simply impossible given kind of the point that like human civilization has reached. We simply cannot have these great saintly individuals like Teresa of Avila anymore, like the Crusaders or whatever other people Eliot wants to point to. Not saying the Infinite Library endorses any of those figures as people necessarily, but it's saying that kind of because society has like reached this point where we have finance capitalism and all these things, you can't ever fully live up to your ideals. There's simply no way to do it. There's too much you have to do to just keep up day-to-day life. And so it's better to just accept that you are at some level going to fail at your aspirations to some degree and to try to find happiness in that middle ground between your abilities and your aspirations.
And that too, I think, is why Virginia Woolf said it was a book for adults, because, you know, in books for children, which there are some good ones, you know, everyone kind of does exactly what they want to do, and there might be a struggle, and there might be, you know, the down part of the action, but you're always going to get exactly what
There's
you want.
There's always happily ever
says.
after, and this is not a book with a happily ever after necessarily.
Yeah. Characters kind of end up in relationships that are fitting, but it's the same time, it's more about compromise and about, sort of, I wouldn't say settling, but like reconciling your immediate environment with whatever your ideals are. I also think what you said about characters is interesting, because you had mentioned Dream of the Red Chamber, and remember in the beginning of that, there's two guys that have that conversation where like, listen, we can't tell stories about heroes anymore. They're not people that are all good or all bad. There are both good and bad people, and that's kind of exists as like a frame for the book to kind of explore like the behaviors in the setting of what that book takes on.
No, I think that's a really, really smart parallel you're drawing, because I think Dream of the Red Chamber is doing something very similar in terms of sort of the way it's positing kind of these noble aspirations or noble qualities that one might look to hold in oneself, and kind of how those kind of fall apart when you are trying to apply them to like the actual business of living in society.
Yeah, which, you know, also when we had read that book, we mentioned how it felt very TV show-esque. Did you get this impression from Middlemarch? Because I didn't. I know there have been TV shows made of this, and I wanted to look into them. I haven't had a chance, but there's something that's, I think unless there was a character of the narrator is moving the pieces around to me that felt more novelly than TV show.
I definitely agree with that. I think that also there's an interesting quality in this book where occasionally it will be kind of episodic and will cut very distinctly from one character to another character.
Yeah.
Like kind of the first time the book does it is when we leave behind Dorothea on her honeymoon in Rome, and we start kind of seeing over the shoulder Fred Vincy and hearing about his various educational and financial woes. And we kind of leave, like, Dorothea is not mentioned for probably, 40 to 50 pages.
Right.
And even then she does not kind of take back over kind of the character. We're never like in their heads necessarily. I always think of it as like we're in the narrator's head, and the narrator's looking over their shoulder as kind of an invisible presence, which I think is, again, interesting.
And that's a nice description too, I think, of I think it's called free and direct. Oh, I should know this. It's like the style of narration where it's free and direct narration, where like the narrator can dip into somebody's head, but it's mostly over the shoulder.
Yeah.
So
But what I was going to say was that's kind of episodic, but generally I found the way that characters kind of came in and out of the story, like one story would tie into another story, and then we'd kind of leave behind the one story kind of gradually and pick up into the other person's story. And there are definitely points in the book where there are kind of those harsh cuts, but I found generally it was more of kind of these things where one story would kind of gradually draw in another story and then kind of get pulled out of that story so we could totally focus on the new story.
Yeah.
Which I think is very much, I'm sure there are TV shows that can pull that off, but it didn't feel like kind of the distinct episodic character that something maybe more like Dream of the Red Chamber, even like Don Quixote has.
Right. Yeah. Where it's like on this episode of Don Quixote, Sancho gets beat up by some farmers. Instead it's like, it opens up, we open on Fred and he's talking about this, and then he gets drawn into something else. He runs into Lydgate and they talk about something, and then they part ways and we end up following Lydgate as he goes and talks to Bulstrode. What did you think about that scene where Fred, who had been gambling and stopped, went to Green Dragon and sees Lydgate there, who has never been seen there gambling, and he's like going hard gambling, like he's getting like really excited, and like they both see each other, and it's like you know, it's like
I feel like something I found that a very funny chapter. I feel like there was kind of this implication that like Lydgate's like steady doctor hands make him like supernaturally good at billiards, and like that's why he's able to win, like, because at that point in the story, like he's winning like every game he's playing.
Wow, I didn't catch right. That's great. Yeah, like he's just
that's the impression I got. That might be a misread on my part, but that's kind of, because again, it says like he enjoyed billiards, but this is like his first time kind of like playing for money. And so I feel like kind of the implication was that like because he has like steady hands or like kind of this certain temperament, he's way better at billiards than kind of the average clientele of this tavern.
Yeah, he's got steady hands. He's unreadable. Nobody knows what he's gonna do. Yeah, it's just. I
found it really funny because there's this great bit where Fred's like he had told himself that he was not going to gamble, but why not just go to the Green Dragon and just hang out? And he was like, I can do it without gambling. But then, you know, the guineas are flying, and if that was happening, why shouldn't he catch a few?
Right, yeah.
And just kind of gradually gives himself little permissions until, he's just as fucked as when he started.
They even say that he set aside like a little, you know, just 10 pounds just for him, just for gambling. Yeah. So,
you know, gambling is actually, I think, kind of an interesting thing in this book, kind of getting into again, kind of our little conversation about debt earlier, you know, that's obviously been part of it. But something that kind of struck me in this book is like a lot of these characters, a huge part of what they are like struggling with in this book is just boredom.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's never again necessarily put in like that blunt of terms. I think because this was kind of just normal for just being alive at this time. You know, again, I think it's something that maybe is a little more apparent in like looking at it from 2024, where again, we live in a world with the opposite problem where we're all so constantly like overstimulated that we can't focus on anything. But like, it seems to me like a huge part of like particularly Fred's problems stem from the fact that he feels like he has nothing to do with his time. And so he ends up getting into these situations where it's like all he really feels like he is capable of doing, all he feels like he's good at or enjoys is like riding horses and gambling. And like maybe there is a character flaw in that. But it's also like there's just so little like for him to do, like that he either like he ends up kind of again taking up this line of business. He takes up land surveying with Caleb Garth, and then
Mary's father,
Mary's father, and then kind of ends up being able to turn that through some good luck into basically running a farm on behalf of an absentee landlord. But that's like clearly like a step down. It's like clearly there's like this element where like he feels so limited by his circumstances. There's the fact that he doesn't want to go into the church, but everyone like he doesn't really like studying all the things he has to do to like get this university education. He doesn't like studying Latin or Greek, but he doesn't feel like he can do anything else in terms of like just kind of keeping himself busy other than these kind of ne'er-do-well-ish pursuits.
Yeah, frivolous things. Yeah.
And again, it's like, man, if only he'd had the internet, he probably would have had a better time. Well, or probably a worse time, honestly.
Yeah, what if Fred Vinci was a gamer?
Like Rosamund, a big part of why she cannot bear later to part with all the furniture and nice things that they have is because she is at some level like confined to her house by kind of what a wife is supposed to do. And so losing their furniture feels to her like, well, what else am I supposed to be doing with that? She's not like Lydgate. She can't go out and have a career. Right. Like she just kind of has to sit around and be provided for. And it sounds like it's incredibly dull.
And and I think too, So at one point, we kind of haven't, we should mention this one plot thing. So Casaubon picks up on some feelings for Ladislaw and Dorothea, and he writes in his will that if he should die, Dorothea will get nothing if Dorothea marries one Will Ladislaw. That's like the one thing that was added to the will. And so like for a while, like Will Ladislaw doesn't know this, but Rosamond in her, what the narrator describes as her like ennui, is really getting into like manipulating people and getting a rise out of them. And so she ends up just telling Will that, like, she's like, oh, by the way, like, and it's like done like very casually. And Will like, you know, freaks out because like he's been kind of like loving Dorothea from afar. And now he's like, well, now there's no point, you know, but like that revelation is conveyed to him through Rosamond, who is, you know, just terrifically bored. And
yeah,
like
just stirring the pot for its own sake.
Right. Yeah. And like, I also liked Rosamond too, because I don't think Eliot ever condemns her, even though she's the most like shallow character, I would say, like, or at least the character that is concerned with like appearances and finery and, you know, having her way. And Eliot is just kind of like, well, you know, that's just how her environment was. And, you know, if we wanted to bring back the Spinoza thing, that's what she thinks excellence is, which is having the most things and being the center of attention.
Keeping a nice house.
Yeah, keeping a nice house and getting her way all the time. And I like, too, that Eliot never really condemns her. It's just kind of like, this is just what her character is.
Yeah, you know, I think this book, and again, it's not really surprising because even though she's writing under a male pseudonym, like this is being written by a woman, you know, this book has, I think, such a just really lovely eye towards its female characters. Like you said, I think that if this book had been written by like Charles Dickens, Rosamond would come off a lot worse.
Yeah, like a stock character or something.
Yeah. And it's just like she would just be a complete frivolous, you know, head in the clouds, you know, vapid airhead who is, you know, making life miserable for her, you know, saintly doctor husband who's just trying to do his work. Damn it.
There's this one aside that was like, I was like, I know I wasn't in 17, you know, 7 or whatever when this book came out, and I probably would have thought it was a male, but there's a bit where like Rosamond like needs to be zipped up, and that's like when Lydgate and her are fighting, but Lydgate still rushes to zip her up, and the narrator says like, oh, the things that men will help us with, or something like and it's such a perfect of course it was written by a woman, like, but that line like particularly is like, so it's like the narrator going like, oh, look what men will do, you know, but
well,
you know.
Kind of from that, I think that same scene, a scene that I found very, very affecting, and again, I think really speaks to just the ways that in this book, I think is really kind of bucking, again, kind of the trend is that something that happens to Rosamond, and the book doesn't make a big deal out of it. There's not a scene where we dwell on this, but she has a miscarriage, you know, and very far along in the pregnancy, it seems like this is not like like 2 months in. This is like 8 months in or something. Like they lose the baby very dramatically.
Yeah, I think a premature birth even, I think, is also what they say.
Yeah. And again, it's not dwelled on in terms of like they don't show it to us in this melodramatic way. But then later when they're having this fight, you know, she just says like, I wish I died with the baby.
Right.
And it's like a really cutting, like cruel thing to say on one level, but it's also, I think, because of the way Eliot has sketched her character and the deft way that she has handled this event earlier in the text, it does not feel like cruel and it does not feel like melodramatic. It feels like it's cutting her heart out to say that. It's cutting Lydgate's heart out when he hears her say it. It's cutting our hearts out as the readers when we hear her say it. And it just, again, it's not cartoonish. It's got this very like deeply inscribed humaneness to it that just, again, I feel like so much writing at this time just does not have.
And you know what's crazy too? Some of that scene reminds me of, you remember did you watch, I think it was Whitewater and Sopranos, where Tony and Carmela have that huge fight where they say all like horrible things to each other. Like it honestly took me back to that, like where the dialogue is so cutting and it's such a picture of like, I'm really like just in distress with this relationship that I'm in, that I need to say things like that. Like that, you know, it's there's almost like a parallel between that, which is like, you know, years later, but.
Yeah. You know, that was a scene that really stuck with me because again, I think it really is a scene where you can see, again, kind of like we referred to earlier, neither of these people are bad people.
Right.
Neither of them are at fault in the situation. They're really, again, part of the problem in this scene is, again, just the way that husbands and wives are supposed to interact with each other. Lydgate has, at this point in the book, he has hidden all these financial problems from Rosamund until they have become unignorable. And like, he has to tell her, hey, we're having money problems because like the next day people are coming to like appraise all their furniture for the bank in case they need to repossess everything.
Yeah.
And it's like, there's this element where it's like, oh, if they had just been able to like communicate normally, like if they did not have all these, again, from 2024, like bizarre expectations about like how like the sexes are supposed to interact with each other, this probably could have been fine and not gotten to this point. They could have met somewhere in the middle and Lydgate could have just been like, hey, here's how much money we have coming in. And Rosamund could be like, hey, this is how much money we need to like keep the household at this level. Like, can we figure out a way to make this work? Everything would have been fine. But because they exist in like this social context where like, as obvious as that seems like to us now, like that is not like on the table.
Yeah, and in many ways, like this book is also a story of characters not communicating with each other because one, I don't think they were supposed to at that time. You're supposed to say things like, for instance, the husband is supposed to say, do this, and you're supposed to do it because I'm the husband, and the wife is supposed to just listen. And later, like when they're describing Dorothea and Will's connection, Dorothea's like, oh, like I can actually talk to you like a peer. like there's like this sort of peer relationship. Dorothea initially thinks that about Kasuban, but it's like not the case as we see later. But yeah.
Well, again, there's another great scene is as Kasuban kind of his health is rapidly declining and it's becoming pretty clear like he's going to die. He calls Dorothea over and is like, I need you to promise me something. And she's like, what? He's like, I want you to promise me before I tell you what it is, because I'm your husband and you have to listen to me. And she's like, can I have like a night to think about it? And he says, oh, so you need time because you're going to make your own choice instead of just doing what I tell you. And then, you know, she agonizes over this. And then eventually she does finally make the decision to agree to it. And he's like waiting for her out in the garden. And she's like, I'm going to go tell him. And she comes out and dies.
Yeah. He just, I guess, had heart failure is what they allude to.
And the implication is that he's going to make her promise not to see Ladislaw any further.
And possibly finish the mythologies too. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I feel like we have not talked about Ladislaw a lot as a character. Do we want to touch on him a little bit?
I think we should because if you read some of the, like, I don't remember when, I think it was when this book came out, people thought Ladislaw was bad. And even the translator of this says he's the least fully realized, which I thought was a nice way of hedging your bets as an introductor, is to say like, you know, it could have been more realized. You know, like it's fine. And I sent you that piece that was like, it's okay that he's not fully realized because that's kind of like his place is that we don't know him as well. And so we can't really understand Dorothea's attraction to him as much as we'd like. I don't know where did you think he was a well-realized character? Do you think it makes sense that Dorothea and him have a connection?
Okay. So here's my thing. So I think Ladislaw is a really interesting character, again, to kind of read from modern times. Because for me, we meet him kind of early in the novel. He's staying at Kasuban's estate, kind of as Dorothea and the Brooke family is really kind of going there, kind of to feel out this marriage proposal before it's kind of formally been made. and they meet Ladislaw, and he's sketching, and he seems to be fairly good at it. Dorothea's like, "Oh, are you planning to be an artist?" And he's like, I'm not good enough at that." And we gradually kind of find out from Casaubon about his kind of strange parentage. Casaubon's sister is dead, but Ladislaw is presumably the offspring of this Polish man of kind of indeterminate but like socially poor background. Like that's one of kind of the funnier things, like in the gossip scenes in the book. Everyone's kind of like the Polish revolutionary, the Polish dancing master, the Polish juggler. Like no one quite knows what this Polish man did, but it was bad. And it shows poorly on Ladislaw. And for me, again, kind of reading it, maybe part of this is like coming from like an American perspective. And maybe part of it's, again, coming just from a more modern perspective. But to me, the fact that he kind of has this mixed parentage, kind of this mixed background, to me made him like almost an instantly sympathetic character who I wanted to like. Because I was like, oh, he's the one person in this whole story who isn't just, some inbred Anglo. Like he has kind of this slightly more continental flavor. And then he, early in the book, like he departs from Middlemarch and he goes and travels around the continent, and he spends a lot of time in Germany and in Italy, and he's studying under this painter in Italy, and he's kind of interacting with all these poets and doing all these things that, again, to me are like, oh, that's really cool. I wish I could have done that. I wish I lived at a time where there were cool things like painting and poetry happening that I could have participated in.
You could go to Rome like like a lot of tourism, I guess. So you'd think, I'm sure there is still some, but like it would have been like a really cool place to hang out, sort of. Yeah, and
well, crucially, like there's a lot of renovation happening in Rome, which is why there are all these painters there that he's interacting with. But I think like to the initial audience of this book, I have to assume that like that was like he was kind of like dangerous and foreign. Like there's this element where he's kind of, and again, he gets wrapped up in this progressive newspaper that Dorothea's uncle starts, and he kind of a lot is made of like his skill with like rhetoric and the way that like it kind of he kind of realizes like, oh, I can like give speeches and I can write things and people like listen to what I have to say. And there is definitely like an ambivalence about his character that I think comes down to his foreignness, but they're qualities that to I think the modern reader make him cooler and more interesting.
Okay, so I just looked this up. He's described as being an Italian with white mice, which I had no idea how to read that comment, but based on this description that I think jives with what you were saying, at the time, Italians frequently roamed the streets of London and other large English towns as organ grinders. 1820, 1830s, a relatively large population of Italian organ boys was imported into London. These street entertainers mentioned by Dickens performed tricks with trained monkeys and mice. So yeah, they literally go like, oh, he's a little carnival urchin, more or less, like who performs tricks for our amusements. So yeah, which would be cool to travel with the circus. But yeah, I think you're right that he's sort of shady, I think is like sort of shady and dangerous.
Well, he has like kind of a romantic air almost. Like he has like, I feel like almost kind of a Byronic quality to him where he's not like tortured necessarily, but he has like this vitality that Dorothea is like the only person he can find in Middlemarch who seems to like mirror that quality. And
and the narrator even says that he's very sympathetic to nuance. Or he's not sympathetic, attuned to nuance. Like he can immediately tell when there's something off in like a social situation as well. And like he's sort of like, kind of aware.
Yeah, so I don't know. For me, I didn't find him like poorly sketched. He's definitely a character. Again, we don't spend a lot of time like looking over his shoulder because part of it he's absent for a good chunk of the book. He kind of, again, we see him like twice in kind of the opening section, like the opening first volume, and then I don't think he shows back up until like probably the third or maybe even
which
the
is
fourth
when
volume.
we sort of check in with Dorothea and Casaubon at their honeymoon, which, surprise, it sucks. Casaubon is not spending any time with her because he's digging through the archives like a good old grad student. And Dorothea's like, man, this marriage is going to suck. And then she runs into Will in Rome, and they have like a very sort of, again, direct communication. Like they talk about stuff. So, right, art specifically. And I like too that like Will is like, yeah, I could talk about art. I don't need to do that. Like it's like, I don't know. He's very, yeah, I think like with Fred, there's this sort of like, you're kind of floating around. You don't know what you need to be doing kind of.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, he has like, if we're talking about like the Conatus again and again, I hope we're not like misunderstanding that idea, but there is this element where he has this aimless quality to him where he seems to have all these talents, but he doesn't know how or where they might be like well used. And he doesn't seem like, even though he has like a talent for them and he enjoys talking about art and things like that, he doesn't have like a consuming passion for any of it the way that maybe Lydgate does for his medical research. It's more just something that he's doing because it's
right.
fun.
Yeah.
And I do think that is one thing that is a little interesting with his character. Maybe again does contribute to this poorly sketched like quality that maybe some people see, is that even by the end of the story, it doesn't seem like he really settles on anything in particular as like,
it just says public life is what it says. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the implication is he gets into some kind of writing based on, again, kind of his role working for this newspaper. And then I think when he's kind of agonizing over whether or not he should marry Dorothea, he's like, there's something along the lines of like, he would not have a lot of money unless he like hired himself out as like a pen or like as a scrawler, right, basically. So I get the impression that like he ends up doing some kind of writing, but his relationship with Dorothea seems to be his real like focus and passion in life. Yeah. And maybe there is something like to that in terms of maybe he's just someone who is not like, his idea of like the good or like the best does not revolve around a career, right, basically, but rather just around like this idea of like finding like a partner in life. Maybe that comes down to the fact that he's spent his whole life kind of being isolated by his kind of weird ethnic and family background.
I also like, I think it's interesting that was sort of the reception of his character at the time, because like, I think he kind of works for the story. And I find like the scenes where he's talking to Dorothea, like there's clearly like a connection there, which like, I think in the beginning, the narrator often says like, they're just two young people, and you get a sense that like there's two peers, and then there's like, the old husband Casaubon where like everything is like stilted and like, and it's like, oh, I can talk to this person like they're, on the same level as me. And that's almost like an initial like spark almost for that. But yeah, like I think, the thing with Conatus, from what I understand it, is like it can also apply to like substances, like the idea of like natural facets will want to continue to be good, because like Spinoza has kind of like a sort of pantheist view where like everything is kind of the same, like and everything is kind of striving. Yeah, exactly. Like kind of like striving together. And so like, I think like, again, whatever Ladislaus striving is, I think you're right that it's more kind of like, it's more in the relationship, or it's more in like being with Dorothea than it is like a specific thing, because like the narrator doesn't even tell us that, it's like, it's just like, it just says public.
He wrote a book, or he, his accomplishments are in his forming this relationship and providing for Dorothea and their eventual children. Which I don't know. I find that interesting. I do think that I think part of it is that, again, there is this element with his character where he's one of the only, and as much as I like his character, and I do think I think he's well developed, he does feel instrumental in a way that the other characters don't. Like he feels like he's kind
Raffles.
Of fitting, he's fitting a mold of like a romantic, like he's not it's not exactly like Mr. Darcy, but he's kind of fitting that same mold as like the, again, yeah, this kind of distant love object who's pining from afar and kind of has this brooding soul that needs to be drawn out in a way that all the other characters feel much more kind of they're themselves, and then we watch them bounce off each other. Ladislaw feels like a character who's put in the story because Dorothea eventually needs to have a husband who will appreciate her, basically.
Yeah, and I said Raffles too, because we don't really need to talk about Raffles, but Raffles seems to exist mostly for plot reasons. He's that weird, like, shady character that shows up, and he's going to tell everybody that the banker, someone we haven't talked about, who I don't think as important, has a shady past. And if he tells everyone that, then the gossip will ruin Mr. Bulstrode, the banker. And Raffles is sort of like, I think even at the time they said he was Dickensian, because he's sort of just like this kind of weird, mysterious outsider who's like leering and maybe possible criminal. I will say that if we check in at the end with Will, Will became an ardent public man, working well in those times when reforms were begun, with a young hopefulness of immediate good, which has been much checked in our days, and getting at last returned to Parliament by a constituency who paid his expenses.
Oh, so he goes into politics.
Yeah, and is just paid his expenses, so he was clearly somewhat successful. So, yeah.
Because crucially, I think something that is interesting in the book is I kept waiting for there to be like some kind of like twist that they find to get out of Casaubon's will, which maybe again is me kind of expecting sort of a Dickensian like plot, capital P plot to happen. I kept thinking like, oh, we're going to find out that like Ladislaw, like, because something that is interesting, again, kind of on the Bulstrode point you just made there, part of his shady past is basically he married Will's great grandmother.
I think so.
And Will's grandmother, Will's mother had moved like somewhere and like shacked up with this Polish guy. The grandmother dies, and Bulstrode had found Will's mother, but basically didn't tell anybody so that he could keep all the money that this old dowager left him and not give any to the daughter. And it's kind of implied that like that's probably why she died so young. Is because she did not get her inheritance and Bulstrode kept it. But I was like, oh, we're going to like, somehow that's going to like, we're going to find out, oh, he's actually like not Polish or something. And so his name's not actually Will Ladislaw. And so the contract's no longer binding and they can get married, but also keep all the property.
A happy ending, a Polish man, not actually Polish.
Yeah, it's like if you did your 23andMe and you found out that you were actually Cuban.
Well, also like that crime too is a lot like the crime that Bulstrode commits, where Raffles shows up, threatens to tell everyone what you just explained, and then he gets ill and Bulstrode kills him by not doing anything. He's supposed to like tell his maids not to give him opium and alcohol, and instead he just doesn't say anything. His servants do that, and then Raffles dies. So
yeah, that is really the one section that did feel like Dickensian, just in terms of like the kind of weird melodrama, like cast everything takes for a minute, and kind of the contrived like plot stuff where again it's like I really did not need Bulstrode to like secretly be holding like Will's inheritance and all that shit. It felt really weird. And like the fact that was so hard for me to like explain what was going on in a way that like nothing else over the course of this episode has felt like overly complicated or like hard to explain.
Honestly, John, I don't think I could have even done it. This is my second time reading the book, because like I feel like by that point, like you're not checking with any of the characters, and like the plot gear has kicked in to like get this story to a close. Because I got the impression that it would like just fan out, because it has like this really cool fanning out quality, and then at some point it's like, oh, I got to wrap this up. So then like various like plot gears like kind of mesh to get us to the end.
Yeah.
So.
And that really is, I think, the weakest part of the book. It's definitely the part where I was like checking my watch, just like, oh man, how much more of this do I have left? And I think it redeems itself at the end,
right?
But I think that it is like the tough thing when you're writing a book like this. Again, it's like the interesting thing, you know, we talk a lot about our sort of ambivalent relationship with, like, again, capital P plot.
Right. Yeah. Plotting.
But at the end of the day, you know, the book is like a narrative form. And so even like if you're writing like nonfiction, like there's always kind of has to be like some sense of like forward momentum just to get us to a some kind of a close. Like, and there are some books that have more and less, and you know, there are traditional and non-traditional ways to approach that, but they're always kind of, I'm not going to say there always has to be. I'm sure there's like experimental literature that somehow finds a way to do away with all this. Right. We'd see if I would agree with that, because I think that, unfortunately, just something has to keep you turning the pages.
Maybe the next season of Infinite Library, we can explore just books that do away with everything.
I think that, you know, this book does such a good job for so much of its runtime, kind of just, letting us watch characters bounce off each other. But I think, again, Eliot at some point had to kind of realize, like, oh, I could just do this forever. I could just kind of keep letting this story just kind of unwind eternally, and it wouldn't really come to, I mean, it would still, I'm sure, have been interesting reading, but at the end of the day, like, you gotta have something to put the front cover on and something to put the back cover on.
Well, it's worth mentioning too that this was like actually kind of experimental for the time, in that it wasn't issued in a 3-volume format, which was the norm. It was actually a 4-volume format, and it was at 2 monthly intervals as well. And they explored like serializing Middlemarch, but Eliot refused, saying that they would be cutting up the story. So more or less it was, because they weren't going to buy a 4-volume format. So they said 2 things at a time for 4 of them, as opposed to trying to sell the publishers a 4-volume book, which everyone said was too big. So I think, to me, and I also like the way that this started, was because apparently she had been working on a story of Dorothea, and she'd been working on a story of Lydgate, and she just kind of smashed them together. So I think like you get this kind of like intersection, and then it's like I gotta close this down, kind of like, and that's where kind of like the plot gears kick in, I think, towards the end. Yeah,
and even then, like, plot is still kind of a weird way to put it, because it's so instrumental in a way where it's like, none of this has to happen, or it could have happened like in a way where it's all just happening in the background, but it's kind of forced to be this thing where it draws all the stories to a close.
Right.
And more or less, basically, Bulstrode gets revealed that it doesn't get revealed that he stole all the money. It gets revealed that he basically killed this guy.
Right.
And then he has lent Lydgate some money, and so Lydgate ends up kind of getting tied into this bad reputation that Bulstrode develops. They're both forced to leave Middlemarch.
Right.
And that leads to Fred Vincy kind of getting his chance to run this farm, which Bulstrode's family owns. Bulstrode is married to one of Fred's aunts, which is kind of how that breaks down. And then, again, kind of the Dorothea kind of gets roped in, because she is kind of, through all this wealth she's inherited, she's the patroness of the hospital. Right. And so she's kind of trying to help Lydgate and Bulstrode, like, who's also involved with the hospital. It's kind of a prominent local gentleman. She's trying to help them kind of recover their reputations, more or less, but it kind of proves to be beyond her abilities.
But she is the one person who speaks up for Lydgate's character and talks to Rosamund about it, which is like, I would say, like the crucial last chapter, besides like the epilogue, is when also Dorothea sees Rosamund talking to Will and assumes that they have a relationship. And then, so basically, like, all of the revelations have to occur, more or less, between Dorothea and Rosamund in this chapter at the end. And that's when she speaks up for Lydgate.
Yes, and that's also where her and Ladislaw kind of admit their feelings for each other. And Dorothea basically comes out and says, like, listen, even if we lose all the money by getting married, I'd still rather do that, because honestly, I hate having all this money.
Yeah, right.
Which, fair enough, I guess. I don't know.
If I were Dorothea, I would simply,
but so basically, all these stories draw to their conclusion kind of based on this inciting incident of Bulstrode kind of getting involved in this Dickensian like episode for a couple chapters.
Honestly, John, though, when you explain it like that, all of the things are justified in terms of like all of the relationships adding up to how the story ends.
It's more the fact that like this Raffles character, like he's been referenced previously in the book, but he just kind of shows up and then kind of has to like die basically, like kind of arbitrary, like he just kind of appears arbitrarily so that he can die, right. So that we can kind of wrap things up. Like it's not even so much that the wrapping up is still very elegant. It's the fact that basically for lack of a better, it's kind of like a Deus Ex Machina, except it's like a Diabolus Ex Machina where this bad guy just shows up and dies, and then everything wraps up.
Yeah, like or whatever, like the inverse of an inciting incident is, because like you know, like you could see a story starting this way, but this signals like the end of the story.
Yeah, like it's the fact that it feels so arbitrary and again like purely functional that this happens exactly at this point in the story. Like it does not feel to me at least like a natural progression of things. It feels like we reach a point where it's like, I want to start closing things up. And so this random guy who has not played a big role in the story shows up. We find out that he actually like has this much like larger role that has only been hinted to so far, and then he dies kind of out of the blue, so that we can wrap things up as cleanly. And again, on the one at the end of the day, especially in kind of given what you were saying about the kind of experimental of this text almost. There is this element where when you read stuff from like this point in time, like I always kind of have to remind myself, like the novel's still like a fairly new form. Like this feels really weird and awkward to like 2024. We've had like, again, almost 2 centuries more to like refine this form. And so what is like obviously like good or bad storytelling to us, even on just like a functional level, maybe wouldn't have appeared that way to Eliot writing in the 1870s. And so, you know, hey, I haven't written Middlemarch. I can't really cast too many aspersions.
Yeah, and like I said, it's like you whereas before it, like characters bouncing off each other. Yeah, to me, I just get this impression of gears turning, where it's like we need to turn the gears to like close this kind of. So, well, you know, that's something really interesting because, like, as we got to the end, I kind of found myself thinking, like, do I really buy that this event would have all this fallout? And I mean, on the one hand, I can't entirely say because I don't, and I've never lived in a rural English village in the 1830s. So I don't. Apparently the basis for it was Warwickshire, but I don't know anything about England to say one way or the other.
I just mean in terms of the fact that, like, I don't know, would Lydgate getting a loan from Bulstrode, who is a banker, crucially, like, would that really tarnish his reputation like this thoroughly? I don't know.
And it's only because people gossiped that Bulstrode had Raffles killed and did it through Lydgate. Is the way the gossip goes.
That's fair. That does change things a little bit because I guess that makes it look more like it's less alone and it's more like a payment to like poison this guy or something.
And there's a great scene too where they go to like a community meeting and they bring this up to Bulstrode and he of course denies it, or I don't know. Actually, no, he says it's like, I can't believe you would accuse me of this. He doesn't even deny it. But as he's leaving, the stress of it makes him fall or like stumble. And so Lydgate unthinkingly offers him his hand, and everybody just immediately sees this as a mark of like conspiracy. Like, and Lydgate was like, oh, I was just doing my duty as a doctor, but everybody just saw me help this man who'd been accused of killing somebody. They're going to assume that I'm involved with it. Like, and they do. So there, that kind of, I think is like, I think like, to me, that speaks to one of her themes of like gossip in a small town, which is kind of a reoccurring thing. Like it almost kind of forces this to happen.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah. Now that you're saying it, I'm buying it a little bit more. You know, it's something that maybe we don't have time to dig into too deeply, but This is the first thing I think we've read for the podcast where I felt like kind of our recording schedule is kind of a sword of Damocles. Folks, this book, my edition at least, is 785 pages. And those are fairly dense pages with fairly small type squished pretty closely together. These are not double spaced pages like I would occasionally use back in my essay writing days in college.
Yeah, John, as I was reading this, because I suggested this one, listeners, and I immediately imagined the scene from Wolf of Wall Street where Jonah Hill says, "Smoke crack with me, bro," and I'm saying, read Middlemarch with me, John. Read Middlemarch, because literally, we read like an 800-page book in under 2 weeks almost. Which is not something I would advise to most people.
So I definitely feel like I got a lot out of it. I also feel like there just inevitably I ended up probably glazing over some of the more subtle touches in certain portions. And so this is definitely a book I'm very excited to come back to in the future. I definitely want to be one of these people who comes back to Middlemarch, 5-10 years down the line and kind of sees how I've grown with the book. And I'm definitely going to take longer than 2 weeks to read it next time.
Well, I mean, as I was telling you, John, one of our friends of the pod, Tom Blood, said that he himself crammed this book when it was covered in a class that he was studying abroad in Oxford, and he had to meet with the teacher for the class to do an interview, which I think is what they do over there. And he was like, "Yeah, I had to go in the reading entirely cold because I finished the book like 5 minutes before going to the meeting."
I will say that despite the length and again the denseness of the prose, it was pretty rare that I found myself feeling like locked up reading this. I feel like it.
Yeah.
There's something about the prose that is very compelling in a way that I, again, don't find a lot of. I can find Victorian writing stodgy and I find Dickens a lot of times, even the Dickens I still tend to I remember reading Tale of Two Cities when I was in high school. And I remember that's probably the book that I had the worst time reading when I was for my required reading, because I just felt like it was just so stodgy and
mannered.
Yeah. To this day, I don't like A Tale of Two Cities very much. Maybe I need to read this. I don't know. But this the book that this reminded me the most of in terms of just the way that the prose just chugs along and just keeps you moving through it was, of all things, Dracula.
Oh, wow.
I reread Dracula just kind of for my own pleasure a couple months ago, and that book about half this length, but it just goes. And I felt like Middlemarch through a lot of it, despite the reputation again that it has as this very slow, sprawling, I think, stereotypically difficult book. I feel like Middlemarch is a book that you hear people say a lot if they're, readers, for lack of a better term.
Like War and Peace or something.
Yeah, that it's this book that it's oh, I'd love to get to Middlemarch, but it's so long, it's so hard, but I never felt like it was. There were definitely bits where I was okay, I need to go back and maybe kind of refresh myself on that, or okay, which character is that again, especially early in the book before you kind of get a full I definitely kind of wish there was maybe a dramatis personae at the beginning of this. I would have appreciated a list of the major players at the beginning, just kind of to help me at the beginning of the book before I kind of learned who everybody was. But I never felt with this book oh man, I can't get through this. I never was worried oh, I'm not gonna be able to get this done in time for the book for the show because I'm so bored in a way that
we haven't had a bad pick yet. So yeah. Well, and too, I think, like I mentioned, I think it's interesting that people of the time would have read this in 4 2-volume installments. So they would have had plenty of time to kind of digest everything. And of course, there was more of a reading culture then. But yeah, like sort of taking it in all at once, it's like it's almost too much of a good thing. So
yeah. You know, that's something I find really interesting. And again, I guess we're kind of getting a little into the weeds as we kind of reach the end here. But I do think that there's something that I think about a lot is just kind of the very different like physical reading culture that people had in the past. Like you said, with novels in like volumes or like serialized. I read a novel for a reading group I was in called Uncle Silas, which is kind of a later period Gothic novel, one of the so-called sensation novels.
Oh, nice.
And the reading group leader like posted links to like archives of the magazine in Dublin that it was like serialized in. And I was like, I'm definitely someone like I kind of always keep like multiple books going at once. I'm always like kind of juggling like probably 2 or 3 books at a time. And it's because I do think that especially some of these older novels, you get a lot more out of, letting them breathe, kind of reading a section and taking a break and coming back to it. And I think that's something that modern literature really kind of lacks. And I think that is kind of a loss in a way. I think that there's multiple reasons for it. I think that like Middlemarch or again some of these other kind of this Victorian literature, I think that it was able to breathe because of the serialized nature of it. And that also meant that, again, things were a little more episodic. It felt a lot more natural to put a book down and pick it back up because there wasn't just, again, this propulsive plot engine just running you through 300 pages. And I think, this is like, I'm really struggling to think of another book that I've read recently that has characters that felt so distinct in the way that they were written, and that like I feel like I could pick up this book in 10 years, just do a random page, and I would still remember exactly what type of person Fred Vinci is. I would remember exactly what kind of person Dorothea is.
Yeah, and we don't have to get into this because we are getting towards the end, but there's clear thought in even to the way that she writes the speech patterns, where Casaubon talks in these long, subjunctive clauses and parentheticals, and Mrs. Cadwallader has all these nice gossipy epigrams, and Lydgate is a lot of I statements. Like there's clearly like an attention even paid to the language and the way they speak. And we talked about Mr. Brooke. He's always like sort of trailing off or misquoting something or saying, "Oh, there's the saying goes," and then not actually saying what the saying is. Like there's like this like there's clear attention to that. And the only thing that I could think of for that is if we ever get to Junior Jr. by William Gaddis, which is a book only of speech. There's no description. He puts all of these ticks into the character's speech so that you really know who's talking. And even there, some people accuse him of overdoing it because he's trying to get by on dialogue only. But like, I almost could draw a line between that and this because like, there's like each character talks in a way that's like immediately apparent.
Yeah.
So,
and again, I kind of wonder again about the ways that like different new forms of media have kind of forced books to change, and like again the fact that TV has kind of taken the place of like this sort of episodic character focused storytelling. Whereas I feel like I feel like most like modern kind of lit is so focused on theme. I think really we kind of can like I feel like again a lot of like kind of upper level fiction, for lack of a better way to put it, really is kind of doesn't value character the same way that maybe Victorian literature does, or at least like Middlemarch does. And
we're less concerned with psychological sort of portrayal.
Yeah. And I'm not saying any of it's necessarily better or worse inherently, but it is interesting just the way that this book feels so different. And kind of, as I'm trying to put my finger on what makes this feel so distinct to, like what is coming out now, because this is a unique book. And
so, John, we read Negative Space together before this podcast, and, we read The Fraud for it. And both of those placed like a high priority on short, like scannable chunks of text. And, Zadie Smith doesn't say that was meant because of our attention span decrease, but B.R. Yeager, like, sort of admitted that. He was like, listen, I wanted to write a book where, like, you could immediately tell how much you wanted to read at a glance and then read as much as you wanted, which I think that led to both of us just mainlining Negative Space because we were just like, I just want to read all of it at once, more or less. And for Zadie Smith, now she doesn't say that, but I suspected that the sort of short chapters that jump around a lot was sort of written as a way to kind of address that. And while the chapters in Middlemarch aren't long, they wall you in a little bit more than I think at least two modern
really
examples that I picked.
Variable in length. There are some chapters that are like 2 pages long, and there are some that are like 20. There's not a lot of standardization there, which again I think is something that I feel like most modern books try to keep their chapters pretty like even in length.
Right. Yeah. To sort of like, again, so you can decide how much you want to read. It's almost like the novelist knows that there are other demands for your attention, and is sort of catering the experience to that, which again, there's nothing I think wrong with that, but I think that's a clear difference.
Yeah. Whew.
Well, yeah, coming up on 2 hours. Yeah. Do we want to just read the last paragraph, or should we just not do that?
What do you think? I'm of two minds. Because on the one hand, I do think it is a beautiful, again, I think really an all-time beautiful passage in English literature. On the other hand, I kind of want to give our listeners the impetus to pick up and read Middlemarch. So I think,
well then,
just as the full extent of the Infinite Library is a mystery, we're going to leave the final paragraph of Middlemarch to be a tantalizing temptation for you, listener, to consider on your own.
I concur. I think while we could wax poetic on it, I think we'll leave it up to you, reader, to discover for yourself.
I am just going to kind of give my my genuine kind of final thoughts here. Do not be scared to read this book, listeners. This is a book that is absolutely worth your time. It does not have to be a slog. It is not nearly the chore or Herculean labor that some people make it out to be in kind of the literary community. It is a really special, wonderful, unique book that I think says some really beautiful things about life. And I got a lot out of it. Again, you can read it in 2 weeks if you really want to. I maybe don't recommend doing that, but you can if time is a real big concern for you. And I guess that is kind of, again, the core theme of the podcast is time is limited. So, hey, if you really want to cram it in 2 weeks, I'm not going to tell you not to. Definitely do it.
Yeah, Infinite Library, a podcast which asks, does it ever feel like the sword of Damocles is hanging over you? Well, that's because it is.
But yeah, pick this one up. It's a classic for a reason. It's a book that I think there's something for everybody here in a very real way. Yeah. It is not a stodgy or dull book. It is really a beautiful portrait of life.
And and I'll say for my part that you may hear me talk shit about realist fiction, but Middlemarch is one of the best to ever do it, so to speak. And so is George Eliot, and I think that's at least worthy of your time, because I think she's an absolute master at, again, portraying social reality in a way that's compelling from a narrative standpoint. And I think there's much to find, whether you are a Casaubon, a Lydgate, a Dorothea, or a Rosamund.
See, that's the trick, Ben. You're all of them, and I'm all of them.
Right.
And it all just depends on where you are in life. Before we close out, Ben, could I say a few words?
Of course.
So, probably we're not going to be expecting this at the end of an episode on George Eliot's Middlemarch, but something happened earlier this month that I really do not feel like the podcast should ignore. And that is that on March 1st of 2024, Mr. Akira Toriyama unfortunately passed away at the age of 68 years old. I don't know about you, Ben, but his work in terms of being a prolific cartoonist and mangaka were really influential on me growing up. I remember watching Dragon Ball Z as a kid, and really being a pretty mind-blowing experience for me. And then getting older and actually learning, oh, there's all these comics you can read. And I think that again, we've never done like a comic book on the podcast, but I think that his influence on literature is pretty staggering if you really kind of dig into all the people who've said that they've been influenced by his work, and just the sheer amount of things he made that have gone on to be influential, not just in comic books, but in other forms of art. I think that we'd kind of be remiss to not, just show our respects. And the library's infinite, and he filled up a lot of that infinite space with so many wonderful comic books and artworks. So to one of the, I think, really most creative and influential writers and artists of the last century, rest in peace, sir.
And a man who made many jokes about being incredibly lazy. Whose influence is unmatched and incredibly relatable. Rest in peace.
Right. Well, Ben, any other closing thoughts before we wrap it up today?
I think that just about does it.
Well, listeners, thank you so much for joining us here on the Infinite Library. As always, come back in 2 weeks. We are going to be talking about
Spring and All, William Carlos Williams.
There we go. I couldn't remember William Carlos Williams. I almost said Pablo Neruda, so I'm glad you beat me to it.
Spring and All, as written by Pablo Neruda, mercifully short. So,
if you're reading along with us, you're getting a little break next week. So we'll see you then. Until then, Semper Books.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to the Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.